1 John chapter 5, verses 9 through 18. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. If we receive human testimony, the testimony of God is greater. For this is the testimony of God, that he has testified to his Son. Those who trust the Son of God have the testimony in their minds. Those who do not trust God have made God a liar by not trusting the testimony God has given concerning the Son. And this is the testimony. God gave us the life of the ages, and this life is in the Son. Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son of God does not have this life. I write these things to you who trust the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have the life of the ages. And this is the boldness we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have obtained the requests made of him. If you see your sibling committing what is not a mortal sin, you will ask, and God will give life to such a one. To those whose sin is not mortal. There is a sin that is mortal. I do not say that you should pray about that. All wrongdoing is sin, but there is sin that is not mortal. We know that those who are born of God do not continue to sin, but the one who was born in God protects them, and the evil one does not touch them. The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. Trust is an important commodity. Trust can make life a simple proposition. Trust can make life a breeze. Broken trust complicates the simplicity and peacefulness of life like nothing else can. Trust enables us to walk down a sidewalk, to obey traffic rules, to step onto a bridge, to rest our bodies on a pew. Trust enables us to walk under a roof, to take refuge in the shelter of a tree, or even share a meal with one another. Trust makes it possible to set aside our defenses to enable rest and relationship. Trust allows us to interact with one another on any basis other than fear. How does our confidence in God measure up? What is our level of trust? My paternal grandfather used to sell insurance, life insurance. I found that out only after I had gotten my license to sell insurance. But I've always felt that life insurance was very badly named. Doesn't keep you alive, does it? It's as inaptly named as fire insurance, health insurance, or auto insurance. They don't insure us against the things the policy is written about. Rather, they offer a measure of financial compensation to those left behind by the ravages of life in its multiple forms. Those policies tell us that when the event in question occurs, we, our families, or our heirs have some financial resource to assist them in coping with the financial burden occasioned by said events. The first life insurance program I'm aware of began in the Presbyterian Church. It was seeking to offset the difficulties of widows left behind to clergy on the event of their deaths. Their clergy traveled around. They lived in a manse, had no farm of their own to rely on to sustain them. And if the clergy died, the minister died, his widow and children were left without any kind of support, becoming homeless in the process. They would become destitute upon the death of their minister. So the church decided to establish a fund to which all clergy and churches would participate. They would contribute to care for the families of those left behind following the death of clergy. They called it the Presbyterian Ministers Fund. That was a policy my parents purchased decades ago for themselves and their children, to provide a sense of security. This was a response to concerns over how those who depend upon us can be cared for in our absence. The policies were also an act of trust. At its inception, it was trusting that clergy all over the Presbyterian Church would trust one another, contributing into the fund to care for their own and for each other's loved ones, especially in the case of an untimely death. They would also trust that these funds would be pooled together as resources operated by a board established to respond to those in need. Without trust, this insurance industry could not operate. In the absence of trust, no one would contribute. No one would believe that when their term came, the resources would be there to cover their loved ones. Many talk about salvation as a life insurance policy, or as maybe fire insurance. The use of the term here is different from the way it is applied by the insurance industry. Salvation in these terms is akin to a dual process of being assured of entrance into heaven and protection from condemnation in hell. While there are multiple issues with this terminology and these symbols regarding these notions, what is of greater concern to me is that speaking of salvation in terms of heaven or hell, punishment or reward, misses the central point behind John's concept of salvation here. Salvation is not about a geographic destination. It's not about getting a ticket punched. Salvation is about living a life in confidence in God. It's about a change in life that begins right now, that has only a secondary interest in some future beyond the inevitability of death. Those insurance policies require or depend upon an event which would trigger them, which would call them into action. And until that triggering event, they just sit in a file. We pay what is due to keep them in effect, but nothing more takes place until the event stipulated in their terms comes to pass. Aside from fulfilling legal requirements of some sort, they have absolutely no function until their terms are triggered. Salvation, on the other hand, is a present reality. John describes it as such. He says it is now. It is not a policy we take out and secure in a fire safe or a bank lockbox. We don't make regular payments to keep it in force. Salvation and even this life of the ages, as John calls it, are present realities. This is now. They are present in that they have already been given to us. We already live in them. Their clauses have already been triggered into taking effect. As John declares, God has already given us this life of the ages. Given us in Jesus Christ, the Son. It is already ours. He follows this up by addressing the confidence that we can have through trusting in the name and the identity of the one who has granted us this life of the ages. If we have received the Son and lean into the Son, this life is already ours. Anything yet to come is simply a further expression of it. Decades ago in Brazil, as my parents were serving as missionaries, they would go to the national convention of the churches. And the MKs, the children of missionaries, a lot of us would gather at what we called MK camp for the week. Our parents would be off in the meetings, and we would go to camp. I remember some 20 of us catching the bus together at the bus station in São Paulo. We were getting on the bus for a 22-hour bus ride down to Porto Alegre, from which we took a second bus to the camp in Santa Maria. Now, don't believe for a minute that MK camp did not start until after we arrived in Santa Maria. The programming may have not begun yet, but as soon as we gathered in the bus station in São Paulo, camp had already started. We were already living into a new reality. We were already bonded. We shared a common purpose. We were relating to one another in changed identities, recognizing that we were headed to camp. We were campers. We were tied to one another. And the camp relationships were already being formed and transformed as we rode those buses to get to our destination. It was the very same thing the following year when camp was in a different state while the church convention was being held. The camp programming might not have begun, but our camp experience already had taken effect before we ever left the bus station. Before we got on the bus. We were already journeying together under a new identity as campers, making our way together in a shared venture, a shared experience, a shared life, a shared destination, a shared purpose. Our identities had shifted from being individuals embarking on a trip to a community embarking on a shared experience. Our interactions were different from those of the other passengers on the bus, as you might expect. We were all headed to Porto Alegre. As campers, however, we had a shared identity and sense of belonging that were lacking among the rest of the passengers. We brought some of them into our conversations. Even so, they were not really of us because of elements regarding our purpose on that bus trip, things that distinguished us from them. It was not being on the bus that made the difference. was not about having purchased our tickets or turning them in to the conductor. It was the expectation of a shared life which shifted this dynamic among us. At General Conference recently, it was also this shared sense of purpose, shared identity, shared mission of belonging, which set apart the gathering of volunteers and observers and delegates and so many others involved in the General Conference. It wasn't just one more meeting. It was not just one more gathering of people who were trying to accomplish some sort of business. It was identity that gathered us. It was purpose that brought us together. It was a recognition that we all belonged to one another in a way that composed this atmosphere at the convention. It was this shared life and purpose that extended beyond the barriers of language, culture, ethnicity, nationality, gender, clothing, and so many other things. The unity we shared was based on trust. It was a trust in God. It was trust in one another. It was trust in our shared purpose, identity, and being joined in fellowship under God. My MK friends on those bus trips to camp were brought together in a similar manner. We shared different experiences tied by common threads. We were journeying together for the same reason. We had enough trust to embrace one another as fellow travelers on a shared journey. This is what assurance in God looks like. This is what salvation looks like. It's what wholeness means. It's not about some far-off future. It's about living and leaning into this shared trust, becoming the beloved community of Christ. Are we confident in our trust in God's love? That God's love is enough to bring us together, to refashion us, to give us a new identity in which we all belong?